Voor ek voortgaan, wil ek net vir François sê baie dankie vir die uitnodiging en die geleentheid om hier te wees vanmiddag. Ek wil ook vir julle sê dat ek gaan vanmiddag in Engels praat en die rede daarvoor is dat wat ons te sê het bedoel is vir 'n baie breër gehoor as wat vandag hier sit voor my. En wat ek gaan sê is daar's net een ding, there's only one thing that we need to talk about here, and that is how we're going to beat the question of expropriation without compensation. Because it presents the greatest threat not to you just as farmers or to agriculture or to the broader economy, but to the entire constitutional edifice, civil rights and the rule of law that this country has faced in 25 years. And I'm afraid that if we do not beat it, we risk condemning our country to a future of failure and poverty and chaos. How do we get to a point that someone in my position can make a statement like that? And the answer for you is that we got here slowly and we got here deliberately. Approximately 12 years ago, as the ANC went to its conference at Polokwane, my colleagues detected change in the strategic environment. We see the first very aggressive attacks on the willing buyer, willing seller model, and we realize that something is starting to change. And in the aftermath of that, to today, we will track more than 30 policy, regulatory, and legislative attempts to undermine property rights in our country. And to give you a sense of what we've been through, I take you through some of them, starting with those attacks in 2007 before Polokwane. Those in turn informed the contents of the expropriation bill of 2008, which in turn informs the dropping, this is the next year, of the proactive land acquisition strategy. Then came the agriculture green paper in 2011 that warned of every risk from land ceilings to EWC, and all of which would be redrafted into other parts of policy and legislation over the next 6 years. Then the next year, we're now in 2012, comes the 20% proposal in the National Development Plan. Thereafter, the next year, the 50-50 proposal of Kugile and Quinty. Then the next year, the Land Restitution Amendment Act, which sought to throw open the door on land claims at a point when the government knew it did not have the budget to finance them. Thereafter, the next play, the Property Valuation Act. We'll have a valuer general who will value your properties, and we're starting to escape the budgetary bind. The year after that comes the Agri-Land Bill that seeks to make the state custodian of all agricultural land in the country, just as the Green Paper had warned, and would thereby allow the state to escape the budgetary bind entirely. After that, the Regulation of Land Holdings Bill that will cap farm sizes and force you to surrender the surplus, then the proposed amendment to the Constitution, and now the recommendations of the Presidential Advisory Panel. That chronology I took you through is 12 markers in the pattern. There are another 20 that I could have listed that have taken us to the point that we find ourselves at today. And that policy and legislative process did not happen in isolation, but in parallel with a still continuing campaign of racial nationalist incitement and propaganda that you stole the land, that you're guilty of the original sin, that you evicted 1 million people from their homes, that you beat and raped your staff, sabotage land reform, chase up land prices, food prices, refuse to contribute to creating a better society. It goes on and on. You know it all because you experience it firsthand. The purpose of propaganda is stigmatization. And the purpose of stigmatization is to make you the other, so that the society loses the ability to empathize with you. So that when you come under attack, policy or physical or whatever the case is, no one is going to come to your defense. Very much along the lines of what has now happened to you. Think of a country this full of civil rights groups and others. How many of those have actually stood up for you and what you do in this country? The twin processes have taken us to a position that you can distill down into two separate but related legislative and policy processes. The first of these is the passage of the expropriation bill. And my colleague, Dr. Anthea Jeffrey, who I think is undoubtedly the leading expert on the thinking, ideology, and policy making of the ruling party, briefs me on the bill as follows. She writes that it's intended to complement a constitutional amendment by setting out some of the circumstances under which expropriation or nil compensation will be payable. And it lists some of those: labor tenants, abandoned land, land used for speculative purposes. It had a total of 5. And if you go through the 5, you think, well, that sounds reasonable, none of them apply to me, until you read a bit further where it says, but the circumstances in which nil compensation might be payable are not restricted to the 5 that we list over here. The lists are meaningless. She goes further to tell me that of critical importance in that piece of draft legislation is to be cautious around the reassurance that nil compensation will be used sparingly, because it says she overlooks the definition of expropriation in the bill, which has been crafted to allow for nil compensation for a host of not just direct expropriations. You suffer the deprivation of property and someone else gets your land or asset, but also a host of indirect expropriations too. And here some definitions are required. Direct expropriation, the state takes your land from you, you suffer the deprivation, someone else the acquisition. And indirect expropriation is another thing entirely. It can be a custodial taking or a regulatory taking. Custodial taking arises where the state takes custodianship, waarderskap, of your property, as it has already done for mineral resources and for water. And a regulatory expropriation arises where the state, for example, places conditions on your product, price controls, or surrendering stakes in your industry to an empowerment partner. You suffer the deprivation, the loss of some loss of the product that you once controlled. But that will not qualify technically as an expropriation. And she writes further for me that under customary international law, as well as most bilateral investment treaties, 13 of which were cancelled over the past decade, expropriation is defined in the broad way to include both direct and indirect expropriations. And she says in case of Section 25 of our Constitution, the definition of expropriation is not there. However, the word, the manner in which it's drafted, would generally be understood as having its usual broad meaning. But in 2013, the Constitutional Court majority judgment in what became known as the Agri-SA case, the Chief Justice, Mogoeng, ruled that expropriation requires the acquisition of ownership by the state, meaning that the assumption of custodianship over mineral rights, which the case concerned, did not qualify as an expropriation and did not merit the payment of compensation. It's the beginning of a neat end run around the property clause aspects of it, of the Constitution. The second process, one is the expropriation bill. The second process is the amendment of the Constitution itself to make explicit what is implicit, that the state can seize your property and not pay for it. And the two work in parallel with each other. The state wants you to watch the constitutional process. The amendment, when it comes, if it comes, will likely be a minor question of wording. But the real action, we think, is taking place in the terrain of the expropriation bill itself, where once that constitutional amendment is through, it will be very much more difficult, if it was possible ever at all, to challenge what will then be the contents of the expropriation bill itself. watch both and how they feed off each other. Dr. Jeffrey went further and last week gave me a briefing on the recommendations of the Presidential Land Panel that we read as fitting quite neatly into the expropriation bill section 25 processes that I've tried to set out for you here. And she writes for me as follows: the panel endorses expropriation without compensation in supposedly limited circumstances, and it lists 10 of those: abandoned land, etc., etc. But again, it makes the point that the list is not exhaustive, simply an indication of what might be taken. The panel further suggests changing section 25 of the Constitution to move away from mandatory compensation, which Dr. Jeffrey writes for me is inordinately dangerous, as it would accelerate, authorize, increasingly open the way, a way that may already be there, but open it even further to virtually any expropriation legislation. The future challenge to the contents of the bill, the expropriation bill, very difficult to mount, much more difficult to mount if this has been allowed to occur. She warns specifically around what the panel calls a compensation policy, under which compensation will range from zero to minimal to substantial to market-related, even if not market value, depending on a subjective set of circumstances. Give you further insight into some of the recommendations. There's one. The panel suggests that all municipalities have, I quote, with the input of local residents, identify well-located and appropriately serviced land that is suitable for redistribution. And then I quote again, individual owners that meet the criteria of land required for redistribution may then offer their land as donations, is the first thing you could do, or into negotiations with the state about disposing of it, failing which the state may proceed to expropriate it. She writes that this is fundamentally coercive. It guarantees that expropriation will become a favored means of land acquisition, despite the panel's statement that it should be just one of several mechanisms, and it will make it, just in this, very much more difficult for banks to provide financing, as just one implication. Second is, and you live in the real world with your feet on the ground. You know the chaos that will be unleashed upon our country if municipalities are given the scope to start considering what of the neighboring property, corrupt often, needs to be taken, let alone sort of helter-skelter expropriation and seizures that might then be triggered. And she goes on about some other suggestions, but I've made the point. She concludes in her note to me as follows, that overall the panel's report reflects an infinite belief in the benevolent power of the state to direct and control the use of land. To maintain such a belief in South Africa, she writes, is astonishing. For here pervasive state incompetence, callousness and venality and corruption are glaringly apparent. Expand, and I want to fit in here with what the previous speaker has said, expand the powers of the state in the ways this panel proposes, and the core characteristics, these core characteristics of ANC rule will quickly spread into the space provided. In practice, what does this mean for you? What is about to happen to you? I wouldn't write the risks off entirely, but I don't think that the cliche of the mob pouring over the hill to seize an asset is the primary thing to fear here. We do a lot of deep dive polling into the country, and none of our polls can get to a point where more than 10% of people, it's usually far below that, tell us that they regard land reform as a priority for the government. I can also tell you about an ANC polling exercise inside the party where land reform was identified as the 13th most important thing people wanted the party to do, and try for yourselves to come up with a list of the top 5 things you want the government to do. It's difficult before you even get to number 13. Our polls also show that rich urban people in Johannesburg's northern suburbs and the southern suburbs of Cape Town think that land reform is a greater policy priority than do poor black South Africans in deep rural areas. And the reason is that those residents of those deep rural areas know what it is to try and exist on the land and therefore wish to escape it so they could also have the lives of South Africa's wealthy, urban, middle-class elites. We don't buy the story that land reform and the absence of reform is a ticking time bomb for our country, and that the government is under incredible pressure to move ahead, failing which some sort of catastrophe is going to befall us. Land and land reform only threatens the stability of our country if reckless politicians are willing to exploit the evil of the historical denial of property rights to black South Africans in order to cause chaos within the country, to deflect attention from failures in far more important areas of policy, such as in education and the labor market. There have been sporadic invasions, and the government has proved powerless often to counter these. But I think here, to a point, you can consider that the government is sincere to a point when it says that such invasions must not be tolerated and that everything will happen in terms of what the law and the Constitution allows, which is the reason why they are busy trying to change the law and to change the Constitution to allow those very things. But I think the chief reasons why there is a sincere reluctance on the part of the government to tolerate land invasions, there are 3. The first is a concession. The ANC is in terrible trouble. We're going to get to that later. And there's a fear within the party that if you light the match on anarchy in this country, where will the inferno that you've set in motion eventually end? It might end outside the doors of Luthuli House itself. This is not Zimbabwe, where a disciplined, ordered security forces are able to direct violence or turn it on and off like a tap. The second reason why the government is concerned and is opposed to the idea of anarchic invasions is a selfish consideration. That if you allow such invasions and destroy the value in commercial agriculture, then what is there left for you to take by the time you get there and try and seize the value of the asset itself? And the third reason why I think there's real opposition to violent land invasions is a strategic consideration. That any step that now significantly accelerates the downward trajectory of South Africa's economy will have direct political consequences for the party itself. It understands in private, in public it pretends it doesn't understand. In private, the ANC understands quite well the relationship between the economy, year-on-year changes in job creation, living standards, confidence in the future, support for the party, and the proportion and number of protest actions in the country that are violent. All those indicators run off each other in exactly the way that you'd imagine they would. So I don't write the risk off of the invasions, but I don't think that is the greatest danger that we face here. Rather, it is something that is perhaps even more insidious. The real danger we've long maintained is that the state seeks to assume custodianship, bewaarderskap, of all agricultural land in the country as it did with mineral rights. The intention here is not the socialist cliché of seizing the means of production, but rather, as my colleague Russell Lamberti says, to regulate those means to the advantage of the state and the party. And it is a method and a principle that has, in many respects already, and will continue to be expanded across many sectors of our economy. Each time the play is the same. The state develops the regulatory power over an economic sector and then slowly uses that to strangle the businesses within that sector into surrendering more and more of the value that they produce to their rent-seeking schemes, to political cadres. And in the case of agriculture, if you were to think ahead, it may play itself out something along these lines, just to give a sense of things. You create chaos, conflict, unresolved disputes, impossible legal processes. And when the society starts to demand certainty, chaos is such a useful political tool. The state steps in and says, as a responsible government, we must put an end to this shambles. So why don't we just do this? We'll take control of all agricultural land in the country. Look at what markets have done to it. Failing, willing buyer, willing seller, and the anger of people. But we're a responsible government. And we don't want to chase the farmers away. Let's rather give people who should be on farms the right to lease those farms, long-term leases, bankable leases. That is a neat solution to the chaos and turmoil and threats to the instability that this current process of land reform triggering. And at first you'll think it's a clever solution. The mainstream media will say what a sensible leadership is what we've seen, even pragmatic. And initially it will work for you. But time will go on and a point will be reached where you'll be asked to reapply for your farming license or permit, whatever it is. And this time you'll be turned down and you'll be told it's because you don't have the right partner. You need to have a partner. And so you'll say there'll be a whole industry of consultants who'll find partners. And you'll get a partner and the partner will have X% of your business and you'll carry on and it's fine because what else can you do? And one day the point is reached. The rules ratcheted up over and over again when you realize that you've lost everything. Because you're no longer a business owner. You don't own your farm, the state now does. You've become a civil servant. You take all the risk, you raise all the capital, you do all the work, but you give the value away to someone else. And what happened to South Africa's mining industry, where I have a lot of experience over my years in this sort of work, is the prominent case study of what may befall you. The industry went along with the surrender of its mineral rights because they thought if we go along with it, we might get along. What are they in any case going to do with us? They can't mine, they have to have us. And they went along with the licensing and they went along with the initial attempts at rent seeking. But all along the way, the conditions were ratcheted up further and further and further. Francois said AngloGold Ashanti has sold its last gold mine in this country. Prominent mining CEOs described the industry as uninvestable, and all that is left is the shell of what it once was. The regulation of the means of production to the advantage of political cadres and employees, and that, I think, is the primary threat, the major short-term threat that we face and must be alert to. But it's a threat, but it's also the opportunity, because in it there is a lesson, and it's the most important lesson that you can learn, that the miners lost control of their industry and their assets because they played along with the initial moves of the government to nationalize mineral rights, thinking, as I said, that if they went along, they might get along. Elsewhere, organized business has actively cooperated with, facilitated, appeased, and enforced the racial empowerment edicts of the government, despite the costs, onto their own members and industries that they are part of. The brilliance of this rent-seeking strategy that passes as empowerment policy, which is a disgrace given the need for real empowerment policies that take poor people out of poverty and put them into the middle classes. The brilliance of this rent-seeking approach is that the state is able to get the victim to apply the policy to themselves. Without the active cooperation of organized business, these policies would not play out across the country's economy. Take the point further. Pensioners now in the firing line under the principles of expropriation without compensation given prescribed assets. They are safe if financial services firms draw a line in the sand and say not 1 cent will we give to the state to finance some mad development schemes. Likewise, doctors, also in the firing line, before farmers, they did not see that one coming, to lose their practices under the National Health Insurance Scheme. They only face that danger if their industry plays along with the ideas at the heart of the NHI itself. And the lesson for you is this, that if organized agriculture, banks, cooperatives, and the related industries, they're all the sponsors of today, refuse to indulge the government's expropriation plans and focus instead on promoting sensible alternatives, then mass expropriation or custodial takings of commercial agriculture in our country probably cannot happen, and then I think you are safe again. All that could happen then is that the state unleashes the security forces to direct the violence to remove you from your homes in the full glare of the world's media. But I think you can call their bluff, because they don't have the courage to do that, because the strategic insight is still good enough to know that given the dire state of the economy, read against what's happening in the ANC, any steps in that direction would trigger a chain of events that the ANC itself cannot survive. It thinks and plans as a party in terms of its strategy and tactics documents. And these are rules, and they're good rules because they work in this business. These are some of the best operators in terms of incremental policy creep and pursuing ideological objectives that they were trained by the best, by the East Germans and the Soviets. The strategy and tactics document says you can advance the revolution when you meet with no resistance. But when you encounter resistance, you must stop, and if it persists, you must step back and wait and not put the entire revolution on the line. Let the lessons percolate, because we're going to revisit them when I make my recommendations to you in a few minutes. The question we haven't asked, and it's central to whether you will be successful in defeating this, is why are we here? Different to where are we and how did we get here? And I'll tell you that nothing that you face or that's happening to you is unique. You have not been singled out for special treatment. You are simply pawns in a much bigger ideological struggle about whether South Africa will survive as a free and open and prosperous society, or whether it will sink in time into a morass of socialist oppression. And it's a pendulum that has swung to its extreme positions in our country at several points over the last 100 years. A timeline, you must start somewhere from which to understand these swings of the pendulum, might as well be 1912 and the establishment of what will become the African National Congress. Initially a moderate and conservative movement relative to what was to come. It will remain that in the 1920s and the 1930s, even suspending some of its liberation demands in support of Smuts's efforts in the Second World War. But 1948 will come around and Smuts is defeated, and as white South Africa hurtles towards apartheid, this moderate conservative movement is hounded and abused and oppressed until it seeks sanctuary in the only welcoming embrace, which is that of the East Germans and the Soviet Union. And it's that embrace that will change the nature of the movement. An important date is 1962, when the Communist Party, under Soviet influence, adopts as its guiding ideology the idea of national democratic revolution. And its lobby within the ANC will see the party accept the same ideology at its conference outside Dar es Salaam in Morogoro in 1969. The doctrine of NDR is based on Lenin's theory of imperialism, that the wealth of colonial powers exists only through the exploitation of the colonized. And the purpose of anti-colonial revolutions must therefore be to dispossess the colonizer, failing which the colonized can never be free. The SACP will make the theory applicable to South Africa through the years by developing a term still in use today, a colonialism of a special type. And the special type means that in our unique circumstances and those of our immediate neighbors, the colonizer has permanently integrated into the society. Will never leave, never go home. But despite that, the purpose of the revolution must be to dispossess the colonizer and everything that flows from him. And you can now extend that as far as South Africa's middle class, integrated if you choose to. And every year, from 1969 to this year, the ANC has recommitted itself with lesser or greater enthusiasm to the idea of national democratic revolution. The critical phrase is lesser and greater enthusiasm. So I start you in 1912 and 1948 and 1962 and 1969. And the next milestone I take you to is 22 years later in Switzerland. And we're at Davos, and Mr. Mandela has been released from prison. And he will appear before the Davos faithful who are gathered there to hear this man who will surely lead South Africa. And what is he going to say? Is it going to be nationalize the commanding heights, which so many had feared, or something else? And for various reasons, the backstory to which is that Mr. Mandela, at great risk to himself, had rewritten the paragraphs of the speech prepared for him on the economy to deliver a far more pragmatic message. And he returns from the enthusiastic reception to tell his party that the world has changed and the socialist experiments that had ruined so many post-colonial African societies are not a mistake this country will make. We will pursue a more pragmatic path. And the risk for Mr. Mandela is he does this before the ANC has had a policy conference. And the difference there to the leadership style of Mr. Ramaphosa is stark, who is trying and failing to lead the country because he is governing within the constraints of what an ANC policy conference decided for him. And the pragmatism that will come out of this, you'll read later in the gear policy in the mid-1990s, that but for internal contradictions was sensible, certainly relative to what we face today. And the pragmatism at the heart of gear and the good fortune of surplus electricity and interest rates that would be cut in half and low household debt levels and a global economy that lifted and a commodity supercycle, the likes of which the world will never see again, saw our country begin to make progress, more progress than we've ever given ourselves credit for. The number of people with jobs doubled in those Mbeki years. So the slur of jobless growth thrown at him is nonsense. Think of this, that through those years, 10 formal houses were built for every shack that was newly elected in the country. And yes, service delivery is a shambles and falls apart and things aren't what they should be. But the sheer scale of what was achieved was extraordinary. When Mr. Mandela went to Davos, we were a country in which 40 whites were graduating with degrees in engineering for every black graduate. Now there are twice as many black as white graduates, but the whites are no less in number than they were in 1991. They haven't been chased into the sea. A budget deficit inherited at negative 5% at the end of the apartheid era was a surplus 13 years later. Debt levels, government debt levels were cut in half, from 48% on the first evening the ANC governed South Africa to 27% in 2007. And the economy, which had been wrecked by the internal contradictions and stupidity of the apartheid system, will average growth of 3% between 1994 and 2003, and then between 2004 and 2007 will grow at 5% for 4 consecutive years. The first time it had done that since 1970, now almost 50 years ago. But like all great, and you use the word in the correct way, great political leaders, Mr. Mbeki is an enigma because even as he's driving the socio-economic recovery, he's planting the seeds of its collapse. His cruel health policies killed hundreds of thousands of people and saw life expectancy fall by a decade. It was under his watch that the arms deal corruption set the precedent for everything that would later happen, from Bosasa to VBS to the Gupta family. It was under Mr. Mbeki's watch, analysts forget, that our country first began to run out of electricity. His cabinet was central to allowing race to give way to merit in the civil service, setting up the collapse of so many government functions. And it was his own unconscionable policy towards Zimbabwe, quiet diplomacy, that enabled the collapse of both the rule of law and the economy in that country and marked South Africa's departure as a peer of liberal democracies around the world. And as Mr. Mandela's influence faded, Mr. Mbeki now on his own will go on to make two further and this time fatal mistakes, the implications of which will intersect to put us all in this room today. And the first was to send the charismatic and very brilliant Jacob Zuma to Natal to wrest from Prince Buthelezi the last of the Zulu nationalist vote, without considering that if he succeeds in what Mr. Mandela and Mr. Mbeki had failed in, will Mr. Zuma inherit from Prince Buthelezi the Zulu nationalist mantle that he'll later wield as a weapon in the ANC, exactly as happened. And second, and unrelated to that, the cruel missteps on HIV and AIDS policy allowed the isolated left of the ANC, isolated since Davos in 1991, to regroup, to build platforms of influence, to raise money, to fight Mr. Mbeki on HIV and AIDS, which was a very good thing, and they saved a lot of lives in doing so. But being good at this sort of thing, it was a simple matter for them to expand the attacks beyond HIV and AIDS to later include the entire gear policy spectrum of what they derisively called the Washington Consensus. And those two mistakes, unrelated parties, Mr. Zuma and the ethnic nationalists, later the looters, and the relative left of the ANC, their interests will coincide in December of 2007 at Polokwane. The Zumites are happy to ride the wave of anti-Mbeki media created by the left, while the left is happy to capitalize on the ethnic nationalism of Mr. Zuma to eject Mr. Mbeki. And in the aftermath of that conference, the two now factions of the ANC go their own way. The one undermining institutions and looting the state, the other, to use the revolutionary term, has reclaimed the levers of power, policy influence denied to them since Davos, and set about everything from pursuing expropriation to the mad NHI policy, the crazy visa regime, and many other, the mining charter, and the litany of policy missteps that put our economy in the position that it is in today. The consequences are swift. Debt levels double, the deficit back to where it was at the end of apartheid. Growth slips, job creation stalls. Every service delivery indicator in our country, after making sharp progress from 94 to about 2007-8, will stagnate, and in recent years, the ground we won in those early decades is being lost as living standards for poor people are worsening. The consequences of it all rise from and are best highlighted by the fact that from 2012, as the global economy continued its gentle recovery and unstable and flat recovery, South Africa's rate of economic growth peeled away sharply downwards, a pattern we'd last seen in the country's economic data in the aftermath of the political instability of the late 1970s. And the consequences of all of this, because the consequences are there, we read them in protest action, you read them in the local government election results of 2016. The consequences begin to trigger for ANC leaders the once unthinkable proposition that could we lose control of this country? And that fear triggered an internal power struggle in the ANC in the 24 months leading up to the Nasrec conference at the end of 2017, in which the two factions, the winners of the defeat of Mbeki in 2007, turn on each other in a desperate attempt to evade culpability for the crisis they've unleashed, both on their own party and on the country as a whole. The result of that conflict is a stalemate, demonstrated in the fact that Mr. Ramaphosa, who belongs essentially to neither camp, wins at Nasrec by a margin of 179 votes out of more than 4,700 delegates, meaning that if 90 people had voted differently, Dr. Dlamini Zuma would be in charge today. And as he assumes power and the factions turn further against each other, they complete the crushing of what had been the moderate middle of the ANC of the Mandela and Mbeki years, and very little of that remains today. With no refuge there in the party, Mr. Ramaphosa has no choice. But when he comes under attack from the public protector and Ace Magashula and the crooks on that side of the party to seek refuge in the only other faction that remains amongst the unions and amongst the communists and amongst the Communist Party, in exchange for which, now in hock to them for their protection, he surrenders more and more of the economic cluster of the cabinet to them, while his internal adversaries, their sworn enemies in the ANC, gain control of parliamentary committees and the caucus and the National Executive Committee itself. A stalemate position has been reached. But it's a stalemate in which the two parties have a common interest in pursuing the policy of expropriation without compensation, although for very different reasons. The ideologues on the left see it as a way to opening the door to some sort of socialist nirvana that we might one day become, while their internal opponents, the infrastructure of the Zuma era, see it as a way to loot what resources remain, and then, the critical thing, to set up the erosion of civil rights and the rule of law, given that they fear how long their party has in power. It is a rule. You surrender property rights and the sanctity of that, you will end up surrendering more and more on civil rights and the rule of law. And all this happens against a context in which ever more the evidence appears to be that the ANC is dying. Forget the 57% headline from the 2009 election. That's what the party got. But if you drill into that, our polls suggested that amongst people with matric, ANC support was at below 50%. Amongst people with university graduates, it was below, with people who graduated with a degree from a university, it was below 25%. And by the time you leave formal urban South Africa, the DA has 75% of its votes, the EFF has roughly 65% of its votes, the ANC wasn't yet at 50%. And on three mega trends, younger people, better educated people, and urban people, the unstoppable momentum that will shape the future of our country, the ANC's voting performance is now on the wrong side of history. And there's enough in those trends alone to put on your radars at least that the ANC can be defeated in the election of 2024. As it faces that possibility, it is also running out of the money that it needs to run the country and dispense the patronage, which is the last glue that holds that movement together. The fiscal position is impossible. The growth rate is a fraction of the deficit. Debt is going to break way through the 60% ceiling of the Treasury and march towards 70, and the budget deficit is going to exceed what the ANC inherited on the final evenings of apartheid rule. And these two trends are happening at the same time, and probably in the same window of time. The 2 years before the 2024 election, the ANC is going to run out of money, and it's going to run out of voters, and it's going to run out of them both at exactly the same time, which means that the party is now at its most dangerous. And be warned, and I quote here from what I think is a very brilliant Zimbabwean author now in New York, Peter Godwin, who reminded last year that no liberation movement that came to power through armed struggle in southern Africa ever surrendered power again. Not the MPLA in Angola, not SWAPO in Namibia, not Frelimo in Mozambique, and most recently not ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe. And you dare not doubt me that there are leaders in this country, some of them, who will look through the horrors of Zimbabwe, the abuses, you know the story. And they'll see through all of that and see only one thing, that 40 years later, ZANU-PF is still in charge, and they will regard that as a success, and they will wonder whether we might not be successful in the same way here too. And if along the way we've surrendered more grounds on the sanctity of property rights, we will have given them one of the keys they need in order to pull that off. What must we do? I'm going to list 5 things. They're a strategy. They're rules. If you implement them, they've tried and tested in these situations around the world, they will always work for you. Number 1, get your analysis right. You need to know what is going on and why. Because if you don't understand that, you cannot begin to resist it or oppose it or present alternatives. Number 2 is you need to organize yourselves. Isolated and alone, you'll be picked off one by one. Join organizations and institutions that fight for you. Those must never unite, but they must learn to work together, far better than has been the case until recently in this context and in our country. And for you, the first and foremost, most important is Agri-SA and Vrystaat Landbou. And you need to be members, and you need to invest in the success of those organizations. Number 1, understand what's going on so you can understand what you're dealing with. Number 2, organize yourselves into groups and let the groups work with each other. Once you are organized and you understand what is going on, step number 3 is to use your influence as members to identify the principles that you will defend at all costs. These are lines in the sand. They can never be crossed. If they crossed, you lose. That's the assumption. And they become the mandate that you give your leaders to defend. Never fall into the trap of negotiating on core principles by allowing your opponents to set the terms of debate. Noam Chomsky said the smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the terms of acceptable opinion and encourage very vigorous debate within those limited terms. In our case, black economic empowerment policy, there is no debate in our country about anything other than how to make that policy work better. A debate about policies that might be better at empowerment than black economic empowerment is not allowed because it is outside the strictly delineated frames of reference within which you are allowed to think. And if you cross that line, you know the accusation. It is only because you are a racist. When the government asks what the maximum size of a farm should be, the right answer is we have no mandate to negotiate about that. Start that discussion by saying 1 million hectares and you've conceded the principle and you'll be whittled down and down and down again. The story to tell is of Winston Churchill, who at dinner sits next to a woman he finds disagreeable, and he says to her quietly at first, "Madam, would you sleep with me for £1 million?" And she says quietly, "Well, Mr. Churchill, I might." And he says much more loudly for the company to hear, "Madam, would you sleep with me for £1?" And she says, "Of course not, Mr. Churchill, what do you think I am?" And he says, "We've established that, we're now negotiating the price." What you do answer is, we don't have a mandate to discuss that, but we want to talk to you and negotiate with you very much on other issues, such as how the absence of proper financing holds back emerging farmers, that they don't have title or access to proper extension services. That is what we'd like to talk about, and not just quietly with you. We'd like to invite the media to that discussion so that you can change. If you don't like the answers, you change the question. It's negotiation 101. Once you know what's going on, you're well organized, and you know what you're going to defend and how you're going to defend it, then you act to defend it. Not one misguided critique or slur against commercial farmers, property rights, willing buyer, willing seller, or anything of that nature must pass unchallenged. Within 24 hours, on the same platform that posted that critique, you must be back there saying that it is wrong for these reasons. It does not work. Margaret Thatcher, you can perhaps see some of my group's leanings, said that you cannot win the politics until you have won the argument. Command public opinion, and you have the most powerful asset with which you can secure your long-term success. But here, the position is that collectively, we are still on the back foot. And I want to also, in doing that, get to something else, which I might as well do here, which is the question of black farmers and the question of white farmers. Black farmers have two strategic advantages over their white peers. The first is that they better understand than many whites what the ANC is capable of. It is capable of many good things, and for a decade after 94, it delivered on them. But it also harbors a historical capacity for extreme cruelty and neglect. The experience of governance in this province over the past decade, a good example. So too the testimony recently of a chap before the Zondo Commission who explained how as a black farmer he could not get state support because he was unable to demonstrate sufficient loyalty to the ruling party. The second advantage black farmers have is that they know better than whites what it's like to live in a country where you can't have title to the property that you own. My colleague Themba Nolotshungu remarked some years ago that having fought so hard for property rights, it was mad, he said, how many people were willing to give them away. My colleagues will soon bring out an alternative report to that of the Land Commission. And in that report, we will propose that the only way to support emerging farmers and do so in a serious manner is to ensure that they have access to title, to finance, and to the support structures that is the very model upon which the success of white commercial farming in this country was built, and that it continues on. And that particularly given the history of this country, black South Africans deserve nothing less than the full benefits of that same model. Beware of the attempts at divide and rule. Decide carefully who your allies really are. Because from where we sit as analysts looking into this world, what we see first and foremost is commercial farmers, and what happens to them is what's going to happen to you all. Now you're well informed, you're well organized, you know what principles you're going to defend, and you're getting the upper hand in the battle for public opinion. For the first time, you're in a position to exert pressure. Farmers around the world, I think of the Europeans, are an immensely powerful lobby. But in this country, that's not the case, and we need to change that. You apply pressure on politicians and the government by taking firm action in an ordered and well thought through and calm and strategic manner whenever an assault is made on those lines in the sand. You do so in the media. You do so by touring the world and talking to investors. You do so by leading and participating in mass actions. You apply pressure on banks and corporations and cooperatives and your suppliers. If they do not demonstrate requisite support for your cause by using those same actions as above, as well as your power as consumers, which is one of the key reasons why you need to be so well organized. We've seen very few corporate executives, including the ones who run companies that benefit from your existence, standing up unambiguously and saying the recommendations in this land panel report are nonsense. They leave you to face the consequences and say that it's unacceptable and you need to change it. No one else is going to come and do this for you. Foreign governments, the ANC's dwindling band of reformers, business leaders, you've got 18 months of evidence of their position, and they're not going to rush to your defense unless you force them. Don't count on the DA and the political opposition. It is not in a good place, and it's not the party that it should be. Don't expend your energy ranting at the crooks and ideologues in the ANC. They've won the struggle for that party, and they are doing, having beaten their more pragmatic colleagues, what they were always going to do. Don't rant at the analysts or journalists who sit in the comfort of their own homes, Pretoria, and write reports about how social justice will arise if someone, from their own homes, how social justice will arise if someone takes your home. They're idiots, and they're doomed to remain so. Only people that get you out of this is yourselves. It's your organization, this. You determine what happens in it. It's a mirror, and it's a reflection of you. But I assure you that if you follow the steps set out in the strategy and draw enough resources to drive it at scale, the chances are very good that this is a fight that you're going to win. But before that, you need to know that it's a fight that you're prepared to put up with, in much harsher circumstances than any of us will face. Stephen Biko, facing a similar problem, said the most powerful weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. You need to make that decision inside yourselves that you want to fight this thing. If you do that and you commit to this strategy, I think this is a fight that we're going to win. And Francois, thank you very much.